So Van Maren goes on and he quotes this Adam Hochschild article, and he basically makes the argument, the standard pro-life argument, that there were abolitionists in Britain, famous ones like Wilberforce, Clarkson, Equiano, and so on and so forth, who sought to abolish the slave trade first and then slavery in the British colonies. You know, like, so it's like first the slave trade, then slavery in and of itself. And that this was a form of incrementalism. It was a form of gradualism. It was a good thing. And they cite that and they say, listen, these modern day abolitionists, these AHA guys, they say that they're abolitionists and they're immediatist, and they connect themselves to people like Wilberforce, and that's unwarranted because it's historically not right. They're covering up something. This is a very important part of this video, so please pay attention to what I'm trying to say, and I wish I could take the time to say it a little bit better, but here's the basic thing. When Clarkson and Equiano and Sharp and Wilberforce and those guys focused on abolishing the slave trade, then slavery, they were not ever saying, let's stop the boats with like the lighter skinned black people first because like maybe that's more culturally accepted, and then we'll stop the boats with like slightly darker shade of skin, and then we'll have boats that only traffic like women, and then we'll have boats that only traffic like children, and we will gradually abolish the slave trade by sort of increments within the evil that they're focused on. They never did that. They did not dehumanize people in the process. They said that the slave trade was wicked, that Britain's involvement in it was contrary to the Christian nature of the country, etc., and they sought the total and immediate abolition of the slave trade. When Wilberforce was fighting for the abolition of the slave trade, people stood up against him and argued for the gradual abolition of the slave trade. So the immediatism versus gradualism thing in the British context was just different, took on the form of within the slave trade. What they do today is they focus on, say, like within, instead of trying to abolish like abortion as a practice and then seek to sort of like eradicate abortion culturally or, you know, in other countries, and sort of like a step-by-step, like abolish, you know, abortion clinics and then move on to abolish, you know, abortion pills or something like that. Like it's not clean cut sort of this task and this task. It's here's abortion, it's evil, let's gradually abolish that evil and dehumanize people along the way. So for example, the pro-lifers will focus on partial birth abortion, let's ban that first. But when they're doing that, they're kind of saying, inadvertently, they don't mean it or anything like that, but they're trying to say the culture, like partial birth abortion, is worse than, you know, early abortion or second trimester abortion. It's like partial birth is bad. So they focus on that, then they move to pain abortion. In that instance, they actually sort of influence the culture to believe that, like, you know, the abortions at 20 weeks and after are worse than the abortions before. So they try to do that gradually down. The next thing will be like, you know, let's ban abortions with heartbeats. If a baby has a heartbeat, then they can't be aborted. And then it'll be like, if a baby has implanted, then they can't be aborted. And then it will be finally, if there's a human being there creating the image of God, then they shouldn't be murdered. And then they'll be abolishing abortion. Now, that sort of gradualism is all within abortion and all the way through. It's dehumanizing people, and it's based on ageism. In Wilberforce's main opposition outside of the actual people who were for the slave trade were gradual abolitionists who were calling for a gradual, incremental, regulated, governmentally controlled, sponsored, and, you know, and done abolition of the slave trade. And it was going to draw it out. That's why Wilberforce opposed it. That's why in Wilberforce's letter on the abolition of the slave trade, he actually has a section called immediate, preferable to gradual abolition. The type of incrementalism that was adopted by abolitionists in the past is nowhere similar. Moving on with the article. If, as AHA often foolishly and inaccurately claims, you cannot be a true abolitionist if you support any incremental legislation, they are retroactively downgrading the original abolitionists themselves. No, the original abolitionists, not just people who call themselves abolitionists, but like we're talking like abolitionists did actually do similar things and call for total and immediate abolition and find themselves being opposed by people who wrote articles like this. You can even watch like The Amazing Grace. I mean, William Wilberforce in that movie gets up and he's like calling for the abolition of the slave trade, and a guy, you know, he gets up and he says, "I am for the abolition of the slave trade, but it must be gradually," right? That's the pro-lifer in the movie. Now, if you really tease out the historical stuff there, that figure really was considered to sort of be, you know, anti-slavery and for the abolition of the slave trade, but he was not among the abolitionists. He was not among the Clapham sect. He was not in Clarkson's sort of abolitionist society community. He was sort of that kind of politician who is gradually going for the abolition of slave trade. And that's who Van Maren should be citing as the person that they're connected to, Mr. Dundas. So additionally, Van Maren's going to go on. AHA has compared themselves to the abolitionists and pro-lifers to those who supported strategies such as setting up colonies for freed slaves in Africa, a strategy that ended up failing miserably. Now, John Van Maren, while he's writing his article, has found out that the incremental strategies, the colonization strategies, did in fact fail. Now, he says that whenever we compare pro-lifers today to being colonizationists, we're in the wrong. Now, this is a little complex here, but Van Maren is still in a British context. When we oppose colonizationists, and we say that pro-lifers are like the American colonization societies, we are talking about the ACS, which was the largest group of anti-slavery activists in the United States of America previous to the rise of the abolitionists in the 1830s, and they called for the colonization, the deportation of African slaves as the answer to the slavery problem. They thought slavery was wrong. They thought it had to be abolished gradually. They thought that slave owners needed to be paid for their losses, but that we needed to free the slaves because it was not right to treat them that way, but deport them out of Africa because they were racist. You know, they were not full-blown racial equality people. Racial equality, you know, like black people and white people can marry people, though you find those among the abolitionists, the Garrisonian abolitionists. I'm not making this up. This is standard historical stuff. That the strategy of colonization was specifically funded by William Wilberforce and Granville Sharp, and Thomas Clarkson spearheaded these things. And then he does mention, so that is true. That's historically true. In Britain, slavery was not going on so much, and there was slavery on the colonies, and Wilberforce, Clarkson, so on and so forth. They funded Sierra Leone, for instance, and wanted, whenever the slave trade was abolished and they moved on to the emancipation of slaves, they would actually have a colony set up for these slaves where they could get the gospel, they could get, you know, Western learning and all this kind of stuff. And it was like this beneficial, benevolent empire stuff that these British guys wanted. Van Maren himself actually notes, he actually says, abolitionists later rejected the strategy. So the very ones he's citing as like being the abolitionists who supported colonization rejected it. Why did they reject it? Because it failed, because it wasn't right, because it wasn't practically feasible. But then Van Maren says that it's inaccurate and such to claim that these were not abolitionist strategies. All right, yes, you're right. They were. These were abolitionist strategies that were later rejected by abolitionists. Abolitionists who supported these bad ideas later repented of them. For instance, when William Wilberforce repented of any incrementalism whatsoever to William Lloyd Garrison. We're not saying that everyone in the past was perfect. We're not saying that everyone who called themselves abolitionists was perfectly consistent with their principles. We're not saying that some abolitionists somewhere didn't do some things that were kind of weird and then they later found out that they weren't good. If Van Maren wants to say, listen, you AHA people, you're wrong because some abolitionists in the past did some things that they later repented of and said, oh, those weren't very abolitionist of us. Go for it, dude, but that's a bad argument. Van Maren starts getting really sort of petty. He says, the alleged historian at AHA often quotes Wilberforce, roundly condemning incremental legislation. Now, I generally quote William Lloyd Garrison more for condemning incremental legislation because he has quotes like, I condemn incremental legislation. Wilberforce is a little harder to quote on that because he's in a different context. It's a British context. But Van Maren, I don't even have to do the work here. Van Maren knows. He goes, having read much of Wilberforce's work, I know these quotes are accurate. So he calls me an alleged historian who quotes this person, but when I quote them, they're accurate. But then he says, but I also know it's undeniable to say that abolitionists did, in spite of their distaste, use incremental steps that ultimately succeeded. Moving on from Wilberforce, he cites Equiano. This is funny. Okay. So later he quotes Equiano as an example of an abolitionist who was a gradualist. And here's how he sets it up. William Wilberforce in 1788 had fallen ill. So William Wilberforce has fallen ill. While Wilberforce is ill, Sir William Dalbin leads a group of MPs. Now Dalbin, I'm not trying to like rain on his parade or anything, but so Wilberforce is ill, and Dalbin leads a bill to limit the number of slaves a ship would carry and require ships to have doctors and register slaves and crews, and a regulationist bill. And then he actually cites that many of the abolitionists were wary of this bill. All right, so he cites evidence against what he's saying. So Wilberforce, the guy he's admitting is on our side, falls ill, and this other guy who calls himself an abolitionist goes and does this regulatory scheme stuff, and he notes that abolitionists opposed it. Okay, but Equiano is a good guy. I am not trying to like walk over Equiano's graves. Evidently figured that a regulatory bill was better than none, and he led a black delegation to Commons and was received by Dalbin, Pitt, and other MPs. Now, his history is very complex, but Dalbin, Pitt, and other MPs at this time were sick and tired of the call for immediate and total abolition, and they settled and accepted this bill and went for it. It ultimately did not have the effect of abolishing the slave trade. You're citing stuff that didn't have any effect, but they felt like, hey, this is good. But making slave ships safer for slaves, even if someone thought that was a good idea then, doesn't make it right to own slaves. By the fictitious standard laid out by the historian of AHA, the most prominent of African abolitionists was not an abolitionist. I've never said Equiano was an abolitionist, but I would say that Equiano was doing something regulatory at the time. And actually, if you read the record or read John Van Maren's article itself, he's admitting that Equiano was acting inconsistently with passing a regulatory bill or campaigning for a regulatory bill because it was good, as the best that they could get or whatever. And then Van Maren says, this is not simply arrogant. This is arrogant historical revisionism and a direct insult to abolitionists of times past. Why are you so intent on making me like insult people in the past, as though people in the past were perfect, or that our principles in the present are, bound up in people being perfect in the past? I don't understand. I'm trying to get at the motive, but maybe this isn't about motives. Well, you go on to say, one can only hope that the historian's motives in making such claims are not as impaired as his research. Easy, dude. Like, seriously, you think if all the abolitionists in the past were really bad, and I still wanted to call myself an abolitionist today, I would not manipulate the historical record. I think that abolitionism is a real live thing. I think it's a biblically based deal that God does among his people. He calls them to wash themselves, make themselves clean, to rise up, to correct oppression, to do justice, to establish it in the gates, to love mercy, to walk humbly with their God, and to be blessed and repent of national sins. I don't care if the abolitionists in the past were perfect, but I do think that they were moved by the same God and had the same principles. So he calls me arrogant, calls me fictitious, and checks my motives. And then he concludes his essay in this way. Can abolitionists oppose incremental strategies? Of course. Yes, they can. He's smart enough to know that. Can abolitionists can also, history tells us, endorse and utilize them? Yes. Abolitionists in history can endorse and utilize various incremental strategies. But according to John Van Maren, they usually see them as not abolitionist, and they usually have to repent of them. It's in his own article. It's like if you read his own article, he refutes himself because he did some research. He went out and tried to do the research, and he did the best that he could with what he had, but he couldn't change the facts. But he goes on to say that among the abolitionists, there were differing views on whether or not to use incrementalism. Yes to the word. And unless, as he seems to, the historian at AHA is attempting to retroactively downgrade all these abolitionists, his theories flap feebly against the evidence of the historical record. Flap feebly. It's like something Greg Cunningham would say. There were differing views on whether or not to use incrementalism. I think that if you were to look at all the chat discussions, all the comments, everything on the AHA Facebook page, you will find among people calling themselves abolitionists today evidence of discussions about whether or not incrementalism is bad or always good. I mean, you will find pro-lifers for sure having discussions about incrementalism versus immediatism for the past 40 years. They may not call it immediatism because that's sort of part of this reignition thing, but discussions of incrementalism go on, and it's usually because there are people who are abolitionists who are having conversations with people who want to call themselves abolitionists. And again, I'm not denying that you can call yourself something. I'm denying that whenever you use a label or a term like that, that it means something, even if you're being inconsistent with it, which you seem to understand because you seem to cite abolitionists who repented of not being abolitionist. So final notes here. You call into question historical analysis, and you say things like abolitionists were all over the board, and I would say go and look, go Google, go to the library, go do whatever you can, and look and see who it is that we're talking about abolitionists. Now, time and time again, over and over and over and over again, AHA painfully associates ourselves with the 1830s abolitionists, the people who call slavery a sin, the people who demanded the immediate total abolition of slavery, the peculiar institution. Those people. That's who we identify ourselves. We quote the Garrisons, the Wells, Wendell Phillips, these guys. None of them are appearing in this article. Because if you were to quote Wendell Phillips or William Lloyd Garrison, man, it would sound like these guys were arguing against modern day pro-lifers because they were arguing about incrementalism. William Lloyd Garrison spent as much time arguing against the incrementalist of his age as he did arguing against slavery. That, John Van Maren, is a historical fact. You can go check it, and you can choose not to put it in your article. Now he ends it with this, because I'm trying to figure out what this is all about. Now, generally when people write this sort of thing, they will tell you either between the lines or somewhere, they'll tell you what their motivation is, where their heart is, what's going on. And he says, the reason I've taken the time to specifically rebut the historical claims of abolish human abortion is that bad history makes for bad activism. So he thinks that the bad history makes for bad activism, which I don't think that our activism is bad. If you were worried about our activism, you would attack our activism. My hunch is that you see all the activism. You see all the activity. You see everything that's going on. You see the establishment of abolitionist societies. You see the growth and spread of the principle that you should never do evil, that good may come. You see more and more people saying no compromise with abortion, right? You see this uncompromising spirit and this relentless activity, and you look at it and you think, ugh, and that jealous thing happens, right? And you get all bent up and you say, I'm going to attack them where I can, and I'm going to go after the history. I'm going to go after T. Russell. Man, you can go after me all you want. It's not going to stop abolish human abortion or abolitionists from doing things. Like, seriously. Utilizing an invented and fictitious definition of historical abolitionism, one that's in the actual Wikipedia article that you cite, they, AHA, have attempted to divide the pro-life movement and direct insults towards many who have worked towards abolition tirelessly for years. We are not attempting to divide the pro-life movement. There is division in the pro-life movement that's already there, where their people believe what we believe and not what their leaders believe, and we are exposing that division, and people are leaving the pro-life movement and moving on to just calling for good and not evil in hopes that good to come, and so on and so forth. And we're not even actually doing the insulting here. If you were to go back through this article, you're doing the insulting, sir. They deliberately insult people's motives, and when pro-lifers respond, they cry persecution. Man, that's in a paragraph right after you talked about my motive. What? It's right here. AHA is free to engage in anti-abortion work however it chooses. Are we? I don't know. If we do that, tend to have this thing happening. It is not, however, free to mangle the historical record at will and present it as fact. Apparently, the only person who's allowed to mangle history is Jonathon Van Maren.